this is what we talked about, the sort of the overall policy management process. So the first thing is essentially defining your policy. So you might have a policy that says, you know, all personally identifying information needs to be encrypted and access restricted to this sort of thing, right? And that's sort of a type of policy. You might have you know, again, it can apply to a number of different types of things that we talked about. So first, it's sort of defining what that is and other broader specific terms. The next thing is then sort of saying, all right, well, let's define some classifications for this policy for assignment. So like one of the things is like, this is PII, and you might have various levels of PII or various levels of privacy codes, right? So you might have things that are marked as PII, things that are marked as sensitive, things that are marked as, you know, HIPAA or FERPA or some of these other types of privacy codes. And you might have different kind of rules, like, oh, if it's PII, it has to be encrypted. If it's sensitive, it needs to be, you know, only available for access this, you know, whatever those things are. But essentially, they're saying for this particular policy, for this particular classification, what are the actions that we want to allow, right? And so you can think kind of broadly about this, and we'll talk about some specifics of types of policy attributes that you have. But the point here is that your classification or these policy attributes are really what defines what action can be taken within that policy on that thing that you're assigning it to. So, you know, there was a field in my CRM database in the person table called Social Security number, and I'm marking that as, I'm assigning that as with the attribute of PII, right? So now that I know, like, well, that's going to follow certain types of actions and restrictions and enforcement upon that. Right? So that's sort of the second step is sort of figuring out, like, what are those classifications and what actions apply or enforcement or rules apply to those things within that policy. Right, once you've done that, then you have another thing to sort of figure out, well, how do you develop the methods for actually implementing that policy or action, right? So technically, right, so now I've determined that I have a thing called PII and it's supposed to be encrypted, and I'm going to assign it to various things. So how do I plan to implement it? Now, it might be different how I'm going to do that in the Oracle database versus the SQL Server database versus, you know, some other place where it's being used. Might have different sort of technical things. So that's the technical implementation or action of that policy will depend on the specific policy, the specific attribute, the specific tool, the specific data system, right? You're going to have various, you know, very specific rules. And this is what I'm saying was sort of in some ways like step 6 that I was talking to this person about, like, how do you specifically implement these things? But what we hadn't really thought about, or what they hadn't gone through and figured out, is, well, what's going on with the what's the overall policy and the classifications that we're going to use that will lead to that execution. There might also be manual actions, like, oh, well, if, you know, this particular policy requires, you know, a notification or an approval or whatever, right? Again, these policies can be very broad. They're not specifically security or privacy, which we'll talk about. All right, so now you've kind of had your broad defined policy. You've got this, you know, kind of the different classifications that you're going to use to apply that policy. And again, it might just be that it's like, you know, checkbox or not checkbox for this policy, or there might be that there's, you know, 7 security classifications that have different rules and actions. And you know, how, sort of, you have a general sense of how you're going to implement it. This step here doesn't have to be done yet. You can work on that later. The next thing is then to go out and actually start assigning those policy attributes to your content. So if you're talking about, you know, assigning it to a database objects or tables or fields, you know, you can go, you know, kind of mark them on whatever repository you're going to keep track of these things. That you know, the Social Security number field and the person table in our CRM is marked as PII. Okay, and that might be done through some sort of initial bulk assignment or just ongoing effort to identify those and catalog those. We'll talk about where and how you document those later. Once you have those things documented, you want to have a kind of a regular feed or extract or ability to take that information, that policy attribute that you've assigned, to inform the policy implementation. So to inform the person who needs to go encrypt that database, someone's added a new code, or to inform someone who's building a report that uses that field that they shouldn't use it in this particular way, or whatever. So, but the tagging of these policy attributes on the objects are really what will inform the implementation of the policy. So the point of this little story here is that you really can't implement a policy without having this concept in a very general or specific way of having policy attributes to know, like, what are you applying it to, right? And what things have that policy attribute associated to it and what things don't, right? So that you can understand this is secure, this is not secure, this is private, this is not private, this requires data retention, this does not require data retention, this requires audit, this doesn't require audit. You know, without sort of going through and tagging those things appropriately, you know, then you're sort of everything you're gonna have to apply it to. So lastly here, you know, once you've got this stuff, now you can sort of execute and enforce those policies, right, based on what those